Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the CJRB Knives Scoria. First off, though, for those of you keeping track of the Scoria at home, I gotta let you know that this guy was sent to me by the maker, by Artisan/CJRB. Reached out to me, said, "Hey Nick, we got a new one. It's slicy." You interested? I said, "Sure, why not? I'll check it out." But as always, I told them I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly. It might be a gem, it might be junk. They did still send it along. Nonetheless, we do have to assume this is the very best quality controlled one of these guys ever, and I'm doing my best not to let this affect the nature or the quality of my review. Next thing, let's do some size comparison. First off, here it is against the Spyderco Delica. And so what we're going to see here is this is not a small knife at all. In fact, here it is against the Rat 2, which will also demonstrate the fact that this is not a small knife. And then here it is against the Spyderco PM2, which is also not a small knife, but this guy is right in that same size category. And then I'll throw it up here against a ruler. And what we're going to see is this guy is coming in right around 3.5 inches, a little under 9 centimeters for you. So this is a pretty big blade overall. This is not a small knife. Next thing, who the heck is a CJRB? Well, CJRB is sort of the more budget-minded wing of Artisan. Although Artisan makes things in the same price range, I don't entirely understand the distinction there, but it is a Chinese-made company that is doing some, they definitely do some cool budget stuff on occasion. So there is that, and then finally, this is going to be a quick review, because honestly, it's a fine piece, but there's not all that much unique here. So let's go on ahead and jump into what I'm liking, what I'm not liking so much. So on the good side, I gotta say, I'm liking the weight on it. It is a relatively lightweight knife. If we put this guy on the scale here, we're gonna see we're coming in around 3.4 ounces for around 3.5 inches. It's about 1 ounce an inch, which is a very nice lightness to it. The knife does feel light in the hand, and the balance on it is pretty solid, so I appreciate that. Next thing, this has a very nice clip to it. Frankly, the most exceptional part about this knife in terms of overall quality and manufacture is the clip here. And so what we have here is a nice clip. It is able to mount to either side. It is actually internally screwed in. You can see there is a separate screw head underneath there to attach the clip. That's kind of cool, right? I guess. So there's that. Next thing, ergonomics on this are nice. Because of this clip being relatively rounded over here, as well as the overall shape, as well as the forward finger choil, this works really well in the hand. I've got to say, ergonomically speaking, this is pretty solid. Can't really argue with it too much. Next thing, action on this guy is fine. It is reliable. It flips without a whole lot of difficulty. On the thumb stud, the detent can be sometimes a little bit on the weaker side, but most of the time, there's no, well, certainly with the flipper, there's no problem here. And then on the close, it is absolutely fine. It is a nice, easy, basic action, and I can't argue with that. And then finally, on the good side, and probably the best part about this knife, is the blade thickness here. This is a relatively thin blade on this guy. If we put this guy up next to the Ontario Rat number 2, what we see here is the blade is right around in that same sort of vicinity, and as a result, we end up with an edge that is relatively thin. It's not like, oh my god, thin, and in fact, I would even go so far as to say the Rat 2 is a little bit thinner behind the edge than this guy is, but it's very clear that they're trying their best to make this a relatively slicey choice, and so having that thin stock combined with a relatively thin edge, again, not the thinnest thing ever, but it's out there, as well as this nice swedge, as well as the steel, which is their AR RPM 9 powder metallurgy steel, which is not, oh my god, and top of the line performer, but you know what? It is a solid choice. So what we're seeing here is a pretty nice blade here that is designed for slicing, and a steel that is a pretty solid choice. So to me, all of that is the good. The blade is quite nice. The action is reasonable. The ergos are good. It's got a nice clip, and it is relatively light. Bad side, to start with, I don't know that I love the black blade. You can call that bias entirely, but it seems a little bit weird with the micarta here. The whole thing ends up kind of, yeah, I don't know, but whatever. The other thing I'll say is the pivot collars on here, although I like very much having those as a touch, they are not particularly, like, for instance, the pivot collar is deeper on this side than it is on this side. You can see that it's not an entirely even kind of mounting. And in the same way on this side, it's a little bit, it comes down to full depth over here, but over here it's sticking up. I can't say I'm super impressed with that. It's one of those things that I don't mind seeing a pivot collar, but especially the non-contrasting color, and then the fact that it doesn't fit super well isn't really blowing me away. Next thing, lanyard hole on here is relatively lazy. It's not the end of the world, but it is definitely a thing. It is also a very, very large flipper tab. Well, not very, very, there's worse, but this is a pocket pecker. It's going to be pecking on whatever's in your pocket all damn day long. And with this relatively thin stock, given they haven't really done much in the way of chamfering, but it's something that I'm not necessarily a big fan of. Almost I would have preferred this as just a thumb stud only knife. And certainly with a belt grinder you can do the same. But because the flipper tab is down on there, it actually limits the amount that you can kind of press down against a flat surface with the knife. It helps a little bit with the ergonomics, providing a little bit more guard in the middle there. But honestly, yeah, I'm not a big fan of the flipper tab on here. I feel like this might have been a little better with a thumb stud only. But if they did that, they would probably want a slightly harder detent. Next thing, I'm going to be honest with you, this micarta is not super impressive to me. It is a very fabric-y, very clothy feeling micarta. It's got almost a denim feel to it. And you know what, that's fine, but in general, I mean, there are beautiful micartas out there in the world, right? You get micarta that looks a little bit more like this here, and this isn't, by the way, even the most beautiful micarta. What do I have around here? There's got to be some better micarta around, but, well, nonetheless, without belaboring the point here, the micarta here feels very fabric-y, and it feels sort of, especially with the kind of fraying at the edges there, it feels very low budget, and I kind of found myself as I was carrying this thinking, God, I kind of wish they'd just done G10, right? Micarta is a beautiful material. It works really well, but I kind of feel like this is micarta that's proof that micarta isn't always better. Next thing, this is a very, very generic design. If you put this guy down, it is sort of just like your basic pocket knife. That's not necessarily a problem. I mean, but the only real unique thing this has going for it is that swedge, and that's kind of there, right? Everything else just feels super generic. It feels like, haven't I reviewed this before from one of 20 other people? It's not really clearing its lane in any particular way, and without the thinness of the blade, I can't say there'd be anything that would really set this guy apart. And then finally, kind of reflecting on all of that, on the micarta, the genericness, the tent, the price on this guy is high. As I was carrying this and using this, I was feeling like, oh, okay, it's probably going to be like $40 to $60, maybe 60 given the titanium clip. Unfortunately, they landed at 80 here. And you know what? It's a fine little knife. It is a good cutting tool, and somebody could enjoy it for a long time. But at the same time, $80 feels just a little bit high on this. They haven't really quite done enough to make this feel like an $80 knife. The little clip here, that's a nice touch, right? But I feel like this would have been much more compelling with a just boring generic clip and a set of G10 here for $40 or $50. But this just, I don't know that they've earned that here. So the price ends up feeling a little disappointing. I don't know if it feels disappointment with itself. I mean, that would be kind of sad, right? That wasn't its fault. I'm sorry, price. You don't feel bad. This wasn't on you. It is a generic, relatively knife here. The micarta isn't super amazing. It is pocket pecking with a lazy lanyard hole. The pivot collar doesn't really work super well, and I don't love the black blade, but that's bias right there. Final conclusion front. This is a fine knife, right? It's got a relatively light construction, a nice clip, nice ergos, a fine action, a great slicey blade. There is a fair amount to love here, right? And I can very much easily see somebody, getting this knife and carrying it and being very happy with it for the rest of their day. I don't love the aesthetics. I don't love the pocket pecking. The tent could be a little stronger than micarta. It could definitely be nicer. The knife is very, very generic, and the price doesn't impress me. But again, this is just fine sort of category, right? It's a knife that I could hand to somebody, and they could be very happy with. And so at that level, it's a very solid piece. If your question is like, Nick, is this a fine pocket knife? This is a fine pocket knife. There is absolutely no concern. And honestly, 50 years ago, is true too, but 5 years ago, this would have been a shining gem, right? With a good unassisted detent, a reasonably solid steel, all of these kinds of things. This could have been very, very impressive back then. Or at a very different price point, this could be a solid gem. This delivered at $50? Yeah, I can totally see it. But the budget knife market these days is completely nuts, in a very good way, I think, for consumers, because companies like Artisan, CJRB, Civivi, CRKT are dropping new models into existence so quickly that keeping up with them would be a full-time job, and all of these models, by and large, are just fine, right? Fine and good and functional, and it works, and somebody could be very happy with it, are the norm now. That's just the way it is, and you can get that for $30, $40, $50, and so it's a very competitive world, and unfortunately, there's just nothing quite exceptional enough here to jump out of there. I mean, the blade is nice, I'll give you that. The steel is nice. I would like to see maybe a slightly thinner edge would have gotten me a little bit more excited about it, but the rest of the knife feels very generic, and there are a few places, like the pivot collar, like the Makata, that just feel a little bit underdone to me. It kind of outweighs well, not outweighs, but it just balances off the blade. It's kind of like they did exactly what they needed to for this to feel exactly mediocre. And these days, in order to really get me excited, I think in order to get a lot of people excited, you need to knock it out of the park, right? You need to do really, really good work. Do everything that you're setting out to do really well. Or you need to do fine, but do it at a price point that is great and puts it at the top of the other, well, this is pretty generic. There's not all that much going on here, but you know what? It'll work well. Then you can really compete. But I don't think this is really doing either. It's not a hit out of the park, and the price point makes it not quite competitive with a lot of the other things that are hits out of the park out there. And so my final conclusion here is sort of weird, right? And I acknowledge there's very much a dichotomy between the daily functional use of this tool and my opinion here. This is a tool that could be a very functional daily tool for a lot of people out there in the world. And I think for a person for whom, all they've ever had are gas station specials before, this would be a shining gem. It would work really, really well. And so at that level, it is a very nice functional pocket knife. There is no real concern in that way. With a fine knife, a fine blade, everything. And I do hope we keep seeing more slicey stuff like that. But at the same time, from the perspective of somebody who's watching the budget knife market and seeing how much harder it's getting every damn day to stand out, to really get somebody, excited about something on the budget end, I don't think that this quite gets there. So I really do hope that Artisan is either thinking about pulling some of these elements up, upgrading things to meet that price point, or dropping that price point down to make this compete with some of the other stuff that's in that same vicinity. But as it stands right now, it's a great knife. There's not a whole lot to argue with of functional substance, but at the same time, it just doesn't end up rating. And I think CJRB's great models in the past is a big reason why, and among other folks. So that's kind of my opinion here. It's a fine knife, but it only works when you're not keeping Scoria or other options out there. Oh, that one worked pretty good. Okay, hope this has been interesting to you, and have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.